For the next 2 hours, we're going to talk about 3 issues that are absolutely central and critical for contemporary South Asia: religion, secularism, and violence. We're going to operate with 2 underlying principles. The first is that effective action always requires deep understanding. The second is to keep in mind that deep understanding is very, very difficult to come by. If it were easy, we would not have these issues to speak about today. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to try and ask, we're going to begin to develop a deep understanding, or try and develop a deep understanding of these issues surrounding religion, secularism, and violence. And we're going to ask the more important question about how actually do we go about developing this kind of understanding, the kind of understanding that we think is necessary for effective action. So the focus is going to be on understanding and on asking how to understand. And the mode that we're really taking in this panel through our speakers is that listening is absolutely critical. That listening, learning how to listen, and immersing oneself in the complexity and the details is at least going to be a first start. And so those are some of the parameters. And the format that we're going to follow is also going to be a bit different than some of the others. We're going to start for about 50 minutes. We're going to have 2 of our presenters, and I'll introduce them to you in a minute, give short presentations on 2 very specific case studies. Then we're going to actually imprison all of you in this room for about 10 minutes and give you something to read. And the price of lunch is going to be that you spend 10 minutes reading these pieces, and then I'll let you out for lunch, which is behind me, but there is no free lunch. And so at lunch, we're going to actually have a partition of sorts. We'll divide the group into 2, and it was going to be this side and that side, but it's uneven, so I will have an alternative form of partitioning us. And the idea is that at lunch, you'll be sitting with your group, and you'll be then discussing the readings that I have forced you to read, to have that lunch. And that'll be for about 40 minutes. And after that, we're going to come back and ask what we've learned and how our understanding of what it means to understand has changed. All right? That's the plan. And so to make this possible, we are very fortunate to have 4 people who've devoted a great deal of attention to thinking about religion, secularism, and violence, and in a variety of ways, and 4 people who are also very, very good listeners. We're going to start with Angana Chatterjee, who is the co-chair of the research project on armed conflict resolution and people's rights at the Center for Nonprofit and Public Leadership at the Haas School of Business at Berkeley. Angana is an academic, has been an activist, and is also an anthropologist. And she's going to start her paper by talking about this cluster of issues in Gujarat, and she's going to end her talk by referring to the instances in Orissa. I'll let her explain what those are. After that, our next speaker is Pinky Hota, who is assistant professor at Smith College, and she did her PhD at the University of Chicago and has been with us in New England now for, I think this is your second year. She's going to start in a way where Angana leaves off. Angana leaves off in Orissa. Pinky's going to start with Orissa and end with Gujarat. And after we have these 20 to 25-minute presentations, then I'm going to stand by the door and not let you out till you read. And then we'll have lunch and continue the conversation. So the idea is really to have a workshop, to not have us just speak to you, but to actually begin a conversation. After that, then at the lunch, my 2 colleagues from Harvard, Harpreet Singh, who's a college fellow in the Department of South Asian Studies, and Shankar Ramaswamy at the end, who is our first inaugural SAI postdoctoral fellow, will be facilitating each group along with Angana and Pinky. So we want it to be informal and meaningful, but we want to keep in mind that we don't want this to devolve into merely a discussion about politics. We want this to be about understanding, and we want to allow ourselves and teach ourselves to bracket judgment as much as possible. Right? So that's where we're starting. It's an experiment, and we'll see how it goes. So please join me in welcoming our panel, and particularly Angana, who's going to be starting. So thank you all.
so much for that very kind introduction, and it's absolutely a pleasure and delight to be here. You can hear me, right? Yes. Okay. The piece that I wish to read today is entitled Gender, Violence and Religious Nationalism. In June 2002, I visited Gujarat. The words of a Dalit boy, age 8, in a decimated colony in Ahmedabad reverberated. "I am not afraid of death," he said. "I'm frightened by life. Look what happens in life." As Muslim and Dalit women stared at each other in silence across a boundary wall that pre-2002 separated their homes, Muslim from Dalit. Religious nationalism has fractured social relations in post-colonial India. Through identity formations, majoritarian power, and minoritization, religious nationalism reaches deep into domestic and public life. Its byproduct, religious and gendered violence, undercuts the ethos of pluralism and openness to difference that underpin the Indian democracy. This talk is an ethnographic exploration of religious nationalism and social suffering in recent history in Gujarat and refers as well to Orissa. In the interest of time and out of respect for a diverse audience, rather than delve into a genealogical exploration, this talk seeks to set a skeletal context, factual and analytical, that is constitutive of a story of Gujarat 2002. I draw on the work of various individuals and collectives and my own on the subject. Gujarat. Gujarat state in Western India has a population of 60.4 million, spread among 25 districts in over 18,000 villages. In 2002, massified violence left over 1,200 dead and disappeared, mostly from the minority Muslim community. The destruction of private property was followed by the displacement of tens of thousands of Muslims. The conflict enforced new dynamics of fear and boundaries of ethnic segregation. Is this better? Yes? Sorry. Okay. Many survivors are still unable to return to their homes and continue to suffer economic losses. Religious violence. In Gujarat, the violence fused together states of militarization and militancy. It built upon and reinforced residual histories of dominance and marginalization. Majoritarian nationalism in Gujarat targeted a community based on their religion, representing existing social and economic issues and conflicts as religious in nature to do so. Contemporary political violence. Veena Das and Arthur Kleinman state belong to a new moment in history. Periods of massified gendered and sexualized aggression institute, as Agamben tells us, a state of exception in which aggression and violence towards certain groups are deemed ordinary. The effects of such routine violence run deep and render reparation and reconciliation difficult, escalating fear, unrest, and cycles of aggression. A study of these embedded dynamics exemplify how aggression and violence in conflict areas target the political and cultural and religious identity of subjugated groups in ways that tear at the dignity of women, destroy their security and communitas, and de-establish their sense of home, or destabilize rather their sense of home. The violence melt together in 2002 emergent and historical injustices to enforce uncharted forms of belonging and dislocation. Preceding the events, economic conditions. Since the 1980s, for example, 100,000 workers lost their jobs due to the closure of 50 textile mills in Gujarat, and this created and escalated tensions between marginalized Muslims and marginalized Hindus in these areas. The Sangh Parivar, the family of Hindu nationalist organizations, mobilized the latter, that is, disenfranchised Hindus, and in 2002, this resulted in horrific violence in many of the areas where the mills, for example, had closed. Between December 25, 1988 and January 3 of the following year, in the Dangs district, more than 20 churches were destroyed and Hindu nationalist mobs assailed and robbed Christians, including their homes. In various rural areas where the violence occurred, the absence of state-operated educational infrastructure led to the growth of Sangh-led sectarian schools that indoctrinated disaffected caste groups, Dalits and Adivasis, against Muslims and Christians. Mobilization within Gujarat by the Sangh Parivar, the VHP, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the Bajrang Dal, and the Parliamentary Bharatiya Janata Party, and Ekal Vidyalaya took place between 1998 and 2002. The circulation, and it included the circulation of hate speech against minority communities in vernacular press. Events of February 27 and until March 1st. Coach S6 of Sabarmati Express, carrying car sevaks, Hindu pilgrims, from Ayodhya, was burned at Godhra, that led to the tragic death of 59 passengers, 27 of whom were women and 10 children, per the report of the Nanavati Shah Commission. Investigative accounts of what led to the fire remain controversial. In 2005, a government inquiry found the fire to have started from the inside and not by Muslims who were outside. On February 27th, Chief Minister Narendra Modi reportedly declared the Godhra deaths to be pre-planned and visited Godhra shortly after the incident. On February 28, Mr. Modi reportedly said that the deaths were an act of terrorism by one group on another. Dead bodies were taken to Ahmedabad and their charred remains were displayed in public. The dead bodies were handed over to the Hindu nationalist Vishwa Hindu Parishad. A call for Bandh, a strike, was given by the VHP and the BJP and was reportedly supported by the aides of the Chief Minister. Preventive actions, such as preventive detentions, for example, were not taken by the government. On February 22nd, 2 areas, for example, in Ahmedabad were attacked, Naroda Patia, an ethnically diverse and economically disenfranchised residential area, and Gulberg Society, a middle-class housing society of predominantly Muslim inhabitants that included parliamentarian Mr. Ehsan Jafri, who was murdered and then hacked. Approximately 165 women, men, and children were killed in these 2 places. Extensive violence occurred in Ahmedabad and several other districts across Gujarat, carried out by organized mobs, some numbering in the thousands, using trishuls, tridents, knives, swords, guns, gas canisters, and bodies to perpetrate violence that included gendered and sexualized violence through rape, gang rape, and molestation. Muslim religious and cultural sites were destroyed. Approximately 360 places of worship were destroyed. Conservatively, 20,000 Muslim homes and businesses were destroyed. Conservatively, 150,000 people were displaced. Hate speech was circulated through newspapers, pamphlets, and leaflets, and orally through rallies. The deployment of the Indian National Army was delayed. State officials were identified in police control rooms. The police refused to act. The violence was pre-planned. For example, voter lists and/or insider knowledge was utilized to identify and target Muslim homes exclusively in mixed neighborhoods. These events have been widely reported and documented by various sources such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and national and international media and scholars. Following the events, the National Human Rights Commission of India in April 2002 indicted the Gujarat government for its failure to contain communal violence in the state, as it was in command over the police and other law enforcement machinery during the events, and noted that the attacks on the minority community were politically motivated. Various segments of the middle classes denied the attacks on Gulberg Society and Naroda Patia or justified them as reciprocation for the Godhra attacks against Hindus. In Godhra, 94 persons were tried with 31 convictions, including 20 life sentences and 11 death sentences in response to the horrific violence. Compensation offered for Godhra victims varied from that offered to the victims of the violence that ensued and was discriminatory. Those accused in the Godhra violence were charged under terrorism laws, while alleged perpetrators of the violence that followed were charged under ordinary laws. The government did not set up relief camps or organize rehabilitation, and instead ordered the shutdown of relief camps that civil society organizations had established. The criminal justice system de facto broke down. Over half of the 5,000 post-Godhra cases were initially rejected. Police refused to lodge first information reports, and cases were dismissed despite eyewitness testimonies. Hate speeches continued, and perpetrators were not held actionable. A high-ranking minister was found murdered after testifying against government officials. The Supreme Court of India had to intervene in 8 pending trials and order protection for more than 1,000 witnesses and set up a special investigative team to conduct trials. Efforts to secure legal justice were spearheaded by civil society leaders and not led by the state. 240 people after 2002 were held in Gujarat under the Prevention of Terrorism Ordinance of 2001. Of these, 239 were Muslims and 1 was from the Sikh community. Psychosocial restitution of affected survivors and social healing was neglected. Discrimination of Muslims continued in crucial areas such as education, where, for example, the government recurrently rejects prime ministerial schemes that provide scholarships for minority students to the detriment of Muslim students. Social and economic boycotts against minorities continue overtly and covertly. Former President of India, R.K. Narayanan, stated in 2005 that there was a conspiracy between the BJP governments at the centre and the state of Gujarat at that time relating to the violence of 2002. On December 26, 2013, Justice Ganathra of the Metropolitan Court of Ahmedabad dismissed the Zakia Jafri protest petition refusing to order a criminal investigation into the allegations therein, including to prosecute Mr. Modi. Mrs. Jafri, Ehsan Jafri's widow, remains committed to continuing her quest for justice. Minoritization. In Gujarat, premeditated violence perpetrated on Muslims because of their religion directly and secondarily impacted the entire community. The tools of aggression were selected based on their capacity to damage what is integral and sacred to the minority subject. Hindu nationalists targeted religious minorities because of their difference, which was reductively presented as religious or falsely ascribed to religion. Minorities were labeled as other, as anti-national, and erroneously marked for their proclivity to violence. The confirmation of the rights of minorities under nation-states is often contingent on their capacity to assimilate. In India, this requires a makeover of ethnic and religious identities and loyalties in ways that are perceived as not challenging dominant notions of religion, nation, the secular, and Indianness. Such practices derive cultural authority from the notion of India at times falsely as a Hindu village, thereby conflating the symbolic nation with an imagined Hinduism. Secularism is used as a bargaining tool in electoral politics. And Hindu cultural dominance seeks to define terms of social cohesion and national identity. It may be assumed, for example, that the political sensibilities of minority groups, of Manipuris, Muslims of Gujarat, or Sikhs of Punjab correlate significantly with their religious identities. Minorities are made to accept majoritarian terms in order to assimilate into and therefore survive within the larger Hinduizing Indian polity per the script of Hindu nationalist groups. Gendered violence and the war within. This is a quotation. On 28th morning, February 2002, our entire area was attacked with people swaying in matadors, scooters, and trucks, and even private cars. They were about 20 to 25,000. We are residents of Narodapatia. First, they started beating the young people with various types of weapon. I hid myself behind a bush. My mother, too, was running, and no sooner had she stopped for breath. After killing my uncles, their eyes fell on us. They started pulling my sister. My grandmother begged for their mercy and asked them to spare my sister, as her marriage had been fixed. They killed my grandmother with a sword. They asked my sister to say, Jai Siya Ram. She refused. Many policemen were standing watching the crime. We were pleading with them to give us protection, but they were indifferent. On the contrary, they started shooting at us. From behind a bush, I noticed that they had pulled my sister toward them and were doing something to her. I wanted to cry for help. Someone closed my mouth, and then I watched them burn my sister along with my grandmother and her sister. Gendered and sexualized violence and conflict as acts of power, techniques of torture, and weapons of desecration has a long and complex history, and is not isolated in terms of ideology or locality. A large body of literature has analyzed the deployment of sexualized violence on women of the other in wars of direct and indirect conquest. The body is signified as cultural property, and rape as a deliverance of justice enacted to punish the woman and assert majority men's dominance over minority men. Through targeting the individual, sexualized violence targets the political and cultural identity of subaltern groups. Sexualized violence against Muslim women in Gujarat turned them as embodied signs into literal and figurative battlefields. Nationalist violence and militant masculinity combined militarization and patriarchy. Militant Hindu women, too, were complicit in such violence. Rape is often a mechanism for sexualizing aggression, as is parading women of the other naked. The use of rape in Kashmir, in extreme cases in Gujarat, and during the partition riots involved the sexual mutilation of women, the severing of breasts, the tearing open of vaginas and wombs, and reveals with horrifying specificity the ways women are discursively framed and socially targeted. And distinctly, tragically, in Gujarat, public and political violence by vigilante Hindus led to the forced abortion of fetuses and their displays on trishuls. Such act occurred in various instances with the local police in attendance. The deployment of violence on women hinges on the abuse of gendered power and the denigration of women. The events of 2002 brought to the forefront the extreme nature of religious and sexualized violence, and in fact underscores the devaluation of female life and the larger glorification of violence against women that is structurally condoned and socially permissible. Gendered and social violence in Gujarat revealed the relation between social violence and gendered violence and endangered the scope of women's rights in conflict areas further than the already endangered and vulnerable conditions of women's rights at home, in society, in the workplace, in prisons and schools. Violence perpetrated during 2002 in Gujarat resulted in women's literal and psychological displacement, evident in the trauma over losing one's home, male head of family and security, all augmented by the added responsibility of child-rearing and caring for the aged and infirm, often without any support. Restitution. How do everyday forms of violence against women facilitate large-scale events of gendered violence? The Hindu right's recurrent use of forms of violence against women in India, for example, have targeted women in riots, pogroms, and armed conflict. A gendered analysis of violence shows that most of all what women share is the way in which they experience this violence through isolation, hardship, grief, and trauma. How does conflict violence affect minority and marginalized communities? A study of the condition of violence in internal conflict illuminates that the epicenter of aggression and the experience of victimization and agency of victim survivors remains, in fact. Communities I have interacted with in Gujarat are often cognizant of the lapse of time and limited nature of resources. They desire acknowledgement, and spaces in which their stories as counter-memory will be respected. They realize the limitations of the moral economy of reparations and historical dialogue, while still holding them as necessary. Reparations necessarily require a calculus around losses and experiences that cannot be quantified or negotiated. Beyond individual claims, there is often a lack of opportunity to formulate strategies for collective healing in contexts where suffering is individualized and redress is individualized. Individualization can become an act of isolation and disempower victims and survivors, while their collectivization may be perceived as the gaining of political and social ground. Orissa. In June 2002, I traveled to Orissa after Gujarat. I'm just getting to the end of it. Carrying with me what Muslim women in Ahmedabad had said, do not forget what happened, as Hindutva activists named Orissa the second to Gujarat Hindu Rashtriya state in the nation. Between 2002 and 2009, I studied and published articles and reports on the current consolidation of Hindu nationalism in Orissa and authored a book entitled The Violent Gods, Hindu Nationalism in India. Having observed the burgeoning momentum of Hindutva's onslaught, I and a colleague co-founded a People's Tribunal during 2005 and 2006. In 2007, I went to Kandhamal 7 days after the violence, and in 2008, I met with survivors 2 months after the violence. In 2009 and 2012, I offered expert testimony to commissions of inquiry instituted after these events. The continuities between Gujarat and Orissa are important to understanding the attempts at Hindutvaization of Orissa. In closing, I would like to read fragments of some testimonials. From Orissa, 2004. Militant Hindu men were aided by women in the performance of nationalist violence in Jagatsinghpur, where Dalit Christians understand Jesus to be the son of a subaltern god. Provoked by the Sangh Parivar on 10th February 2004, 7 Dalit women and a male pastor were forcibly tonsured by upper caste and Hindu-identified Dalit members against their will to signify their return to Hinduism. A fragment from a testimony. The crowd formed to surround us. People we have known all our lives moved toward us, shouted and threatened. They held us down. The women held us down. Our clothes were torn. They beat our bodies and dragged us as we tried to get away. Some of them, our family. We had called each other Bhoni, sister, before. They wanted their hate to stay on our bodies so we could not forget. And in closing, in 2008, on 30th September 2008, I received a note from Ajay Kumar Singh, a human rights activist of Christian heritage, entitled, As I Saw the Day in Kandhamal, Mourning What Is. And I quote, "It has been a painful day for us all, not only because the type of incidences of killing women are new, nor because the children are attacked, or because the old and aged that are infirm were axed, nor because more than 100 houses have been burnt in a single attempt, nor because the sleepy villagers are attacked when least expected at 4 a.m., nor because trees were felled from all directions during the daytime, nor because the villagers begged the security before the police officials. They begged for security before the police officials, nor because the police party could not stop the attackers numbering around 6,000 that came from nowhere, nor because in every attack to a great extent people know the attackers and tell the same to the police and administration, yet they are not convinced of the identity of the attackers, nor because force was deployed in villages where people are prone to attack. It has been a painful day for us all, because this is the place where Christian and Hindu, tribal and Dalit live together in harmony. It is in this area now that the relatives are at each other. Brother is against brother, son is against mother, daughter is against father. After a couple of days, one of my associates, a tribal, used to call his immediate cousin an ideal leader. Now they have burnt each other's houses, and what more is in store for them? For what and for how long? The administration calls for peace meetings. How do we have peace? Thank you.
Remember what I know some of you came in a bit late, so I just want to remind you what we're trying to do. this afternoon. What we're trying to do is we're trying to understand, and in the process of understanding, we want to always try to bracket our judgment, at least for now. So we want to listen. We want to try to hold all of these things in our mind in their full complexity. Pinky is going to also speak more about Orissa and these two horrific situations. So we want to hold it all in our mind, and we'll read a piece, and then as we have lunch, we'll begin to discuss it. But again, remember, it's really difficult for us to focus on just understanding and try to bracket the evaluation that otherwise is forced upon us from reading almost anything about it. It's just a reminder of what we're trying to do. So Pinky, and then after Pinky finishes, we'll divide our group into two. We'll read for 10 minutes, and then we'll have lunch and talk about the readings and the presentations, and then meet back up together as a group after lunch. Pinky.
Thank you all for being here today, and I look forward to discussing this further after the talk. Can everybody hear me? No.
You'll need to
Oh,
speak.
well, okay. I will try my best to kind of project my voice a bit more. So, as many of you know, India is days away from knowing the outcome of its ongoing elections. One of the most vexed questions in India then right now is, will Narendra Modi be elected the next Prime Minister of India? Modi, a member of the Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party, is best known for his tenure as Chief Minister of Gujarat. Under his watch, as you were just told, the 2002 violence in Gujarat saw, by some estimates, 2,000 Muslims killed over a 3-day period by rioters, at times abetted by Gujarat government officials. The Supreme Court of India investigated Modi in his role as head of the state government during that time by appointing a special investigation committee that went on to attest to his innocence. Since then, Modi has become highly visible in national politics as a pro-development candidate. A major section of middle-class Indians believe that Modi will provide remedies for economic and infrastructural setbacks under the Congress party. Others are vociferous that the election of Modi will erode Indian secularism. In a recent and much circulated opinion piece, Shekhar Gupta, editor of the national daily Indian Express, attempted to allay fears in a column entitled "Secularism is Dead." Among Gupta's assurances were statements such as, I quote, "India was not a secular country because only its minorities wished it to be secular. India is secular because its Hindu majority wants it to be so." Going on, India gave itself a secular liberal constitution because a vast majority of all its people, in fact almost unanimously, determined that this was the finest formulation for nation building in a land as diverse and complex as ours. In a country where the determinants of identity change every 10 miles, from religion to caste to language to ethnicity to culture, tribe, sub-tribe, and region, secularism is the glue needed to keep it all together. It isn't just a charter to protect Muslims, the Hindus need it as much as them. That is all the more reason why India is secular and must remain so, unquote. Gupta argues for the necessity in believing in secularism in India by underscoring its weight for the Hindu majority. Secularism is not just for the minorities, Gupta insists, but for this majority. Betraying an anxiety about the abandonment of secularism altogether, and to assure those who fear an irrational takeover of the secular liberal vote, Gupta advises that they place their faith in the law and the constitutional protections that safeguard secularism in India. I start here today with Gupta's statements about secularism on the eve of India's electoral results because they crystallize so many key assertions about where secularism stands in India today. As an aspirational ideal, seemingly fundamental to keeping an idea of India together, but also one that has become contested by the rise of Hindu nationalism and a voting public that no longer sees secularism as an unmitigated good. But today I want to show that it is imperative that we view India's project of secularism from the vantage point of minorities, not just marked by religion, but also by ethnicity. I draw on fieldwork done in Kandhamar in 2007 and 2008 to show how the law and constitutional provisions for minorities in which Gupta exhorts us to place our faith, in fact yoke together ethnic and religious citizenship in dangerous ways, betraying the contradictions that riddle Indian secularism. In so doing, I want to suggest that religious violence can precisely be born from the project of secularism in India. But first, the violence in Kandhamal that begins my inquiry. On August 23rd, 2008, Swami Lakshmananda Saraswati, a prominent Hindu nationalist leader, was shot dead in the complex of a residential school that he ran in the remote tribal majority district of Kandhamal in central Orissa. Within hours, Maoist insurgent groups claimed responsibility for his murder and declared it a warning to Hindu nationalists to stop what they called the religious communalization of the district. Even as local law enforcement officials confirmed these claims, Hindu Kandhas, a tribal group mobilized in large numbers into an aggressive Hindu nationalism, assumed that local Christians were in fact responsible for the assassination and that there existed a complicated nexus between Maoists and Christians that conspired to harm Hindus. Shock, anger, and fear coursed through the district. For over 20 years, Lakshmananda Saraswati had been the architect of the Hindu reclamation of Kandhamal, coordinating a series of strategies of community mobilization to displace the strong presence of Christian missions. During this time, he had become known as an iconic and powerful leader, much revered by Hindu tribals and feared by Christians in the district. Drawing on this iconicity for local residents and exacerbating tensions, several Hindu nationalist leaders insisted that Lakshmananda's body be carried out in a procession through tribal villages so that his followers have a chance to pay their last respects. Hours later, Hindu Kanthas began rioting and rampaging throughout the district, assaulting several Christian locals and missionaries, burning churches and shanty dwellings of Christians to the ground. Soon the violence assumed greater proportions as reports poured in of missionaries being publicly beaten and being burnt alive. Within hours, the violence from Kandhamal had spread rapidly to other parts of the Orissa state and elsewhere in the nation. In the reports that followed, blame was variously pinned on Hindu extremist pedagogy, antagonisms between the two significant minority groups, the Kandhas and the Panas, over land holdings, and the failure of the Orissa state to ensure the welfare of minority communities. In order to ward off these accusations, the Chief Minister of Orissa, Naveen Patnaik, issued a statement locating the violence not in Hindu right-wing mobilization, but in the conflicts between scheduled tribe Kandhas and scheduled caste Panas in the region, hinting at recurrent and episodic ethnic strains in the region over land rights, employment opportunities, and religion. This violence in Kandhamal, alternately discussed as a communal riot and as a byproduct of recurrent ethnic rivalries, appeared as another reminder of the changing landscape of indigeneity in India. Over 84 million people, that's 8.2% of India's total population, are classified as scheduled tribes, the juridical referent for peoples constructed by the state as original settlers. And yet, on the few occasions that the Indian public is forced to acknowledge tribal India is when it registers as a site of growing turbulence, as newspaper headlines alert them to wars between tribals, mining corporations, religious factions, and Maoist insurgents. Contrasting metropolitan India's idiosyncratic but purportedly successful encounter with neoliberal capitalism, tribal India continues to provide glimpses of the dark side of Indian democracy. In the eyes of the state and the Indian public, tribals seem to engage in seemingly irrational violence to the detriment of the nation's development and, less importantly, their own. Even the most generous commentators lament that minorities are easily brainwashed by the irrational appeals of religious factions. It remains poorly understood that, far from being symptoms of the irrationality and illiberality of minority political agents, such violent disruptions are in fact rooted in liberal rationalities particular to contemporary India. These include the relationship of tribal communities to state-led development, the increasing politicization of the tribal indigenous category, and debates around the relationship between ethnicity and religion. In 2007, these tense and contradictory rationalities were laid bare during my fieldwork in Kandhamal. A fight broke out between Kandhas and Panas over affirmative action benefits. local Christian Panas had been making bids to to be reclassified as Kandhariya Panas, literally Panas like Kandhas, which would accord them tribal status. These manipulations had angered local tribals who saw this as an encroachment upon their tribal identity, and also Hindu nationalist workers who had long taken issue with the presence of Christian missions and the large number of Christian minority converts in the region. I sat on a village square among a gathering of Kandha men. A Hindu nationalist leader, Sahu Babu, was conferring with a few Kandha tribal leaders over this issue of why Panas were petitioning for their reclassification. Sahu Babu emphasized that Kandhas must assert their heritage and not allow it to be sullied by Christian Panas. He turned to me and pointedly said, "Our Kandha brothers know these Panas for what they are. Panas are like crows, they are scavengers. They will even prey on the flesh of the dead. They will eat any filth that anyone gives them. To fill their belly, they can be anything, Hindu or Christian, tribal, Dalit, it doesn't matter to them. They are so cunning that they will switch sides whenever it suits them." One might be tempted to see the tensions the nationalist mobilizer attempted to play upon as a product of primordial ethnic rivalries. And this was certainly how the matter would be discussed by the state as natural, recurrent, and therefore outside of its control. However, these tensions were very much a construction of liberal recognition in India, Indian constitutional categories that formed the very basis of India's affirmative action policy. In the state's affirmative action program, groups formerly known as the Untouchables and now by the juridical reference scheduled castes such as the Panas and Kandhamar, who converted to Christianity are exempted from affirmative action benefits, while the scheduled tribes, groups like the Kandhas, could avail of benefits regardless of their religious identity. This religious disqualification has had particularly serious implications in Kandhamar, where over 65% of Panas in the district have converted to various denominations of Christianity. In the past 2 decades, the tribal category and its ability to tie into a powerful politics of indigeneity has been seen in the formation of states in the Indian polity around tribal identity and increasing bids by ethnic groups to lay claim to tribal status. In Kandhamar too, by 2007, it had become clear that while Kandhas were perhaps the most materially impoverished residents of the district, the tribal category itself had become powerful because of its seeming potential in securing material gain and social advancement. This increasing understanding of the tribal category as one of a paradoxical privilege is made most apparent by attending to the evolution of these juridical categories that form the basis of India's affirmative action program. The scheduled tribe category included aboriginals, and this is a term that the British used, and it was this classification first started by the British colonial administration in 1901 on the basis of loosely identified tribal characteristics that included spatial and cultural isolation from the mainstream Hindu population. As Alpa Shah notes, both caste Hindus and colonial officers were invested in an ordering of Indian society along what J.G. Fraser has called low savagery to high civilization, in which tribals occupied the savage end and upper caste Hindus represented high civilization. This category of tribal has become furthered in the Indian state's governance, prominently as a juridical category of classification, which serves as the basis of state governance and provisions. The most enduring relationship between tribal development and the modern Indian state has been secured by the creation of this category that provides affirmative action to tribal individuals in government-owned education and professional settings. Since 1950, the Indian Constitution provides reservations, as they are known in India, in state-owned educational institutions and employment for tribal individuals. Affirmative action then has become a kind of ever-proliferating fight over marginality and its codification and recognition via constitutional terms. These processes then contain within them a contradiction. On the one hand, they intend to erase difference by securing opportunities of education and economic uplift to assure ascendancy for tribes. Yet, because the distinct category of tribal continues to be reproduced both in constitutional and state discourse, these communities are marked as different. Over over the past 20 years, these markers of difference have been increasingly called attention to by tribes themselves, as well as have become implicated in a larger transnational politics of indigeneity emerging the world over. This politics of indigeneity, in this case, bears some resemblance to what has been called elsewhere as a politics of recognition, in which institutions of liberal democratic government attempt to safeguard cultural difference between frameworks of liberal citizenship. However, even as these categories have come to function as both added markers of difference and avenues of recognition, the scheduled tribe category has become embroiled in a struggle of competing inequalities, in which marginalized groups struggle to be classified as such in order to secure affirmative action benefits from the state. Additionally, the Indian Constitution also lists another group of minorities known as the scheduled castes, who are also known by the politicized referent Dalits. First formulated in 1936, this category was the British administration's attempt to safeguard the interests of caste groups previously known as untouchables, who were subjected to oppression and avoidance by Hindu upper castes due to their ritually low and impure status. Though historians of the Indian Constitution draw attention to the vague criteria and inconsistencies present from the very inception of the category, the original formulation of scheduled caste was carried into the modern Indian Constitution. The sociologist André Bataille has long insisted that the lines between caste and tribe are shifting and permeable, that no one ethnic group in India can lay claim to indigeneity, and that the lowest caste groups that have been separated from tribe in a somewhat arbitrary fashion can also be regarded as indigenous. But increasingly, scholars are beginning to recognize that this was a serious warning, and that privileging the tribal category as an indigenous category can indeed have detrimental effects for other minority communities. This paradoxical privilege of the tribal identity as indigenous relative to the Dalit community is especially significant when brought into conversation with religious identification. As I had mentioned earlier, nearly 65% of Pana Dalits in Kandhamar have converted to Christianity. Tribals too converted to Christianity, but in smaller numbers, but have since been reclaimed or reconverted by an aggressive Hindu nationalist mobilization. This shift in identification does not endanger tribals' recognition by the Indian state. However, Panas would only receive benefits if they were Hindu, often having turned to Christianity by the promise of social ascendancy that precisely offered a turn away from caste Hinduism. Panas struggled to keep their Christian faith while attempting to seek recognition from the state. To avoid disqualification from affirmative action, Christian Panas had started concealing their Christian affiliation and furnished fake certificates that attested to their status as Hindus in order to get jobs. These practices of concealment and manipulation of state categories have come to be seen as necessary evils for Christian Panas to safeguard their economic development. Christians often continue to privately practice Christianity while maintaining a Hindu identity in the public to secure employment and benefits. These furtive attempts of Christians in Kandhamar to hide their Christianity from public view were not the only anxious moments I witnessed in Christian communities in Kandhamar. Most Christian mission workers in Kandhamar were particularly reluctant to discuss the issue of religious conversion and its relationship to Christian service efforts, often insisting that it was their duty to extend care to Dalits and tribals because of the extreme hardships they faced. They always hastened to add that in no way did they insist on conversion or threaten to withdraw care if people did not convert. Throughout my inquiries, there was more than a trace of fear following. Occasionally, mission workers felt the need to conceal the catechism classes in their mission-run school or the distribution of grain and clothing at Christmas. Amongst these Christian informants in Kandhamar, there was no monolithic conversion narrative that drew an easy link between material provisions and conversions. Sometimes, even after long relationships of patronage, villagers expressed doubt about their own beliefs and reasons for conversion. This doubt sometimes was expressed as a conflict about an inability to know their own interiorities and of a fear of the descent into uncertainty about oneself. Suro, a 90-year-old man, was a single man with a family who had almost entirely converted to Christianity. He was the only one who had not converted. An evangelical preacher described him as reading the word of Christ, but emphatic that he did not wish to officially convert. When asked, Sura spoke with a quiet eloquence about why he wouldn't. I'm too old, he said. If I put one foot on one boat and another on another boat, I will be adrift at sea. No, I will drown. Will I go to Hindu hell or Christian heaven or neither? No, I must know who I am. Sura's dilemma was palpable. True faith and true belief, he had been told, should be independent of material laws. These scenes from Christian lives in Kandhamal reveal an undercurrent of anxiety and self-doubt in the constant disavowal that religious belief was not and should not be motivated by material gain. Why is it that we should regard religious belief as distinct and separate from political economic gain? This separation of the material from the religious and the interrogation of religious behavior that does not see the two as separate can be traced back too to secular law. Let's now turn to its particulars. In 1967, one of the earliest laws banning religious conversions in the Indian polity was instituted in Orissa, which reflected these interrelated preoccupations with purity of belief and motive, especially amongst minorities. The Orissa Freedom of Religion Act of 1967 sought firstly to regulate all conversions by instituting a system of administrative controls, including the filing of returns on every conversion, and secondly, to prevent conversions by force, fraud, or inducement. Significantly, however, although the terms force, fraud, and inducement were clearly defined under the Indian Penal Code, the Orissa Act deviated so substantially from this established definition so as to leave little doubt that they were aimed specifically at making Christian proselytizing a criminal offense. Force was expanded to include the threat of divine displeasure or social excommunication, inducement to include the offer of any gift or gratification in cash or kind, and fraud was defined to include misrepresentation or any other fraudulent contrivance. The Orissa law provided for imprisonment of up to 1 year and a fine of up to Rs 5,000 for persons convicted of the offense of forcible conversion. Interestingly, it's double the amount of punishment if the person convicted is a woman. Bracketing the fact that the law considers both minorities and women as particular kinds of subjects with compromised rational faculties, the law prominently insists on a separation of a purely religious domain from a material political one. It exhibits a concern with the legitimacy of conversion, involving the assessment of the motives and volition of minority converts in order to determine whether conversions are products of false material promises or true religious belief. The historian Rupa Vishwanath has traced the emergence of these concerns back to missionary encounters with Dalit groups, who came to mission workers requesting mass conversions. This was an alien form for mission workers whose mode of proper conversion was challenged by the social as opposed to the individual nature of these acts. Vishwanath points out that it was not merely the social versus individual form alone that rendered them deviations from the proper form of conversion. Missionaries lamented that in the Dalits, bodily and spiritual misery was so closely connected that they could not be separated. She points out that Dalits fundamentally posed a challenge through the mission's dichotomous division of the world into spirit and matter, becoming the very paradigm of inauthentic conversion. And yet, because these interests could never be eliminated, much to the mission's annoyance, missionaries also needed to attend to them so as not to appear to be merciless hypocrites, even though they feared what they were producing were, I quote, rice Christians. As missionaries and colonizers found it difficult to acknowledge this seemingly intractable problem of Dalit materiality, there was a proliferation of discourse on the dualism between spirit and matter and how to manage cases where it appeared to be absent. The laws around religious conversion brought such Christian moral panics about the inseparability of spirit and matter into present-day debates about the corruption of religious belief via capital. In contemporary India, too, government assessments of the legitimacy of conversions tend to rely on two assumptions. First, that people who convert in groups may not have freely chosen conversion, valorizing assumptions about individual free will. And second, that certain minority groups are particularly vulnerable to being lured into their religion. Anthropologists have pointed out that an emphasis on an interiorized religious belief does not get at religious practice in non Christian traditions. And indeed, religion as a category of separate activity and analysis is constructed by being artificially pulled out of a larger field of sociopolitical desires from which it is often inseparable. Yet it would be far too easy to trace back the Christian roots of Indian secularism without acknowledging its simultaneous Hindu assumptions. Scholars such as Laura Jenkins have noted that these conversion laws are also Hindu majoritarian in their interrogation of conversion as an impulse of proselytization. And seeking to examine and regulate proselytization, laws around religious conversion attempt to police an impulse alien to Hindu religious practice, one that is not content to link religious identity to birth and therefore become immutable by human action. Article 25 of the Indian Constitution grants the citizens of all religions the freedom to profess, practice, and propagate their faith in a way that does not disrupt public order and does not affect public health and morality adversely. And this is a direct quote from the Constitution. It is clear that such a statement seeks to sanitize and contain the practice of religion, making it then worthy of the state's protection as a space of true belief and uncorrupted practice. Religions that proselytize are configured as challenging public morality by obfuscating the lines between the religious, political, and material. If the state's liberal framework both attempts to define what constitutes religious practice and volition, it demands that the religious subject perform a state script of morality that does not threaten the public order, maintaining clear distinctions between religious belief and political and material gain. Yet at the same time, political and material gains, or at least the promise of them, have become imperative to the state's relationship with ethnic minorities in its affirmative action program. In part, these laws may be seen as attempts to clearly define the state's role and delineate its paternalistic patronage of minority communities versus non-state religious actors, revealing contradictions in contemporary India, where the state's welfare program for caste and tribe groups are ever more heavily supplemented by NGOs, transnational development agencies, and faith-based organizations. Because Hindu nationalist efforts grow in underserved areas precisely to rival Christian mission influence, their approach appears less as providing services in spaces of state neglect and more as engaging in a mimesis of Christian missions. On the one hand, Hindu nationalist workers attempt to emulate and compete with Christian service provision. On the other, they critique missions by accusing them of inducing a pathological economic dependence amongst the residents of Kandhamal, and by invoking the implicit scripts of doubt and suspicion of Dalit religious subjects and Christian proselytization encoded within the ban on religious conversions. Both Kandhas and Panas would be repeatedly described as particularly vulnerable to false allurements by religious groups and differentially configured as victims and mercenaries. Far from being protective of their religious freedom, the law seemed to provide morally loaded scripts around religion and capital that were manipulated by Hindu nationalists. Religion and materialism must not be intertwined, nationalists insisted, invoking the law, and drawing attention to the clamoring materialism of the Dalits, who could, I quote, be Hindu one day and Christian the next, only to fill their bellies. This frame of the spurious nature of religious belief became a space for Hindu nationalists to cast Kandha tribals as authentic indigents as compared to their inauthentic Dalit neighbors, appearing more worthy of Hindu nationalist reclamation and less corruptible by promises of development. As Hindu nationalists drew attention to the fact that Christians in Kandhamal could not keep their religious faith and material concerns separate, Kandhas began to see the Pana bids towards reclassification as evidence of the enduring cunning and mercenary nature of Panas. The encroachment of the Panas upon their distinctive tribal status angered the Kandhas, which was further fueled by Hindu nationalists to incite violence against Christians. These tensions came together in violence that gained national and international attention in December 2007, and again in 2008 when Kandhas torched Pana villages, ransacked churches, and assaulted Christian missionaries. The struggle over affirmative action and religious identity in Kandhamar brought to public consciousness how different the two ethnic groups were in the eyes of the state. If the tribes were figured as beneficiaries of the state's patronage, sons of the state, at least in theory, the Panas appeared as less than full citizens, their needs spurned by the state. As I conclude today, I would like to return to some of the implications of what I've discussed for Indian secularism. As is clear in Shekhar Gupta's commentary, secularism is both a much celebrated and much abused term of special import in India, a nation that seeks to idealize itself as celebrating unity and diversity while grappling with factional identity politics that repeatedly reveal such platitudes as hollow. It's well known that Nehruvian secularism in newly independent India did not aspire towards the Enlightenment secularism that sought to banish religion from the public sphere. Instead, Nehruvian secularism sought to give equal status to the public presence of all religions. Encoded in the constitution as Sarvadharma Nishpakshata, or non-partisan regard of all religions in the public sphere, Indian secularism heavily invokes ideas of justice and the equality of all religions in the eyes of Indian law. Yet the categories of recognition and protection that allegedly attempt to safeguard minority communities reveal the inconsistencies and contradictions that riddle such a vision of non-partisan equal regard of all religions in India. And it's become noteworthy that several sites in which Hindu nationalism has actually grown harnessing the law. Critics of Hindu nationalism in India have been insistent about the falsehoods of its recruitment, its attempts to brainwash communities via religious appeals, and the artificial nature of the monolithic identity it advances. Others, including liberal upper-class Indians, think that secularism should be rebranded secularism, a false ruse used by political parties to garner votes from minority groups and an impediment to the election of a Hindu nationalist government that promises development and efficiency. At such times, scholars insist that we be careful with the critiques we advance about Indian secularism. Some point out that perhaps it is dangerous to abandon secular ideals lest it further a violent Hindu nationalist takeover of Hindu culture and politics. And historian Sumit Sarkar has pointed out that the fascist ideology in Europe was in part born from this turn-of-the-century move away from the values of Enlightenment rationalism. It might seem then to be a particularly contentious time in which to advance the possibility that perhaps Hindu nationalism might be flourishing by harnessing the mechanisms and discourses of Indian secularism. However, today I want to at least suggest that secularism, as it is encoded in the Indian state's legal framework, might be undoing secularism as social ideal. Perhaps we might begin by inquiring into the blind spots of Indian secularism and by asserting that it must always be evaluated through the vantage point of India's minorities, marked both by religion and ethnicity. It is through this engagement that it becomes possible to ask what forms of religious and ethnic citizenship are available for Dalits and tribals in contemporary India, and how interrogating the project of Indian secularism may reveal the promises and failures of these forms of citizenship. Thank you.
So what we need to do now is we're going to divide us up into two groups. One group is going to read one piece and be part of one discussion group at lunch, and the other group will read the other piece. So I'm going to have Harpreet pass out the things to group one, which is going to be the people who are not sitting at the table and the people sitting at the table up to Deepthi. And then the other group, Shankar, will pass out to everyone sitting at the table. Shankar, you need to pass out that to everyone at the table. And what we need to keep in mind, remember, is we've heard two very different kinds of discussions. One, we want to keep the phenomenology of the violence and the analysis implicit in it in mind, along with the range of categories and the complex ways in which religion, secularism, and violence play into each other that we saw in Pinky's piece. And the idea is that if you just take 5 to 6 minutes to read what's being passed around, that, along with holding these two very different talks in mind, should be the basis for a discussion at lunch where, remember again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand, we're trying to make sense of the complexity that was presented to us in a way to understand and learn how to understand so that our judgments about what to act in the normal political conversations we have might have a more richer context, all right? So if you could just take 5 to 6 minutes, I'll make sure lunch is ready, and then I'll come back and free you from the room to go have lunch, all right?